So, Craig, very nice to spend a bit of virtual Zoom time with you. We haven't actually been in touch for a bit of time. In fact, not since you left Friends of the Earth, and you've done your first 6 weeks now or whatever as new chief exec of Wildlife Trusts. Very different set of challenges, I've no doubt. Are you okay in lockdown mode? Is it all making complete sense that you can't actually go out and never see any wildlife?
Well, it is rather strange, Jonathan. I started officially on April the 1st as Chief Executive of the Wildlife Trust, so maybe that should have been a bit of a clue. It's very strange to start any job, let alone this, when you really can't. I can't really leave this attic room very much. But it's been fantastic, actually. I have to say, you have to look at the positives, don't you? Try and look at the positives, and what's been great is because we have been using video conferencing a lot. Probably I've managed to get around and meet many more people than I would have done otherwise. Spread all across the country. You know, it is really frustrating that I'm not meeting many people face to face. And I've met 4 people precisely now at reserves, socially distanced, since I started 2.5 months ago. But it's kind of crazy that I'm starting a whole new job as chief executive, and 2.5 months in, I haven't made it to the office yet. It's quite odd. But
it is quite odd.
But I'm enjoying it immensely, and it's amazing to discover about an organisation. I mean, you know, obviously when you sort of go for these jobs and you get into them, you think you kind of know it. But Wildlife Trust, we've actually got the amazing statistic I've discovered over the last couple of months is we've got more nature reserves than McDonald's has got restaurants in the UK. In fact, 1,000 more, which I rather like. And
what?
We've got 1,000 more nature reserves than McDonald's has got restaurants in the UK.
Okay, that is the first really impactful statistic for this conversation, because you've taken me completely by surprise. So what is the total number then?
So 2,300 nature reserves across England, Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland, the Isle of Man, the Isles of Scilly, and Orkney. I can't forget any of these. And we've also crunched the numbers because it was very important to me. 60% of the British population live within 3-mile walk of Wildlife Trust Nature Reserve. And this for me is really exciting, Jonathan, because any new chief exec coming in wants to know what's our USP and to be really clear about that. And I think the answer is staring us in the face for the Wildlife Trust. It's about local nature. And, you know, we've really discovered that during lockdown, of course. And I'm always struck by that news report that the weekend before lockdown, when it seemed half the country charged across the country to go to Snowdon on one weekend and all go up the mountain the same weekend. Well, that wouldn't be good at any time, let alone during lockdown. And actually, I think the more that we can help people discover nature on their doorstep and celebrate nature on their doorstep, as opposed to thinking it's something that's far and away and distant, the better. And reconnecting people with nature close to where they live, I think, is very, very important.
Yeah, no, I quite agree. Now I want to come back to that, because I think that whole story about connectivity and interpreting that differently for the future is critical. I am conscious, Craig, that this is quite a big week for you. You've got a big announcement, press launch tomorrow of a new report from the Wildlife Trust looking at the contribution that nature could make to helping address climate change here in the UK. Pretty staggering opening figure or lead for that press release, that 30% of UK emissions could be addressed via nature-based solutions. Can you say more about that? I think people will be astonished by that.
Well, this is really one of the reasons I wanted this job, Jonathan. I mean, I was really happy at Friends of the Earth. I would have been happy carrying on another year or so there in that role. But something that's driven me mad over the years is how people, even in our sector, often talk about climate change as one issue and the ecological crisis as another issue, and then social justice as separate issues. We'll come into that later. But you know, compartmentalize these issues as if they're separate, and somehow that we can address them all in turn separately. Actually, they're inextricably linked. And on climate and nature, you know, there's no hope of us being able to stop runaway climate change unless we solve the ecological crisis, and vice versa. You only have to think about, well, where did all the carbon go in the ice ages? It didn't leave the planet, it actually went into the biosphere. And then, of course, as nature grew in abundance in millennia past, of course, then some of that sunk to the bottom. The clues in the name became fossil fuels. Actually, the clue is right in front of us as the integral role that nature played in natural variations of climate over the many millions of years, and now actually how crucial nature is as a role to play in part of the solutions. And yes, we worked out as Wildlife Trust that if we really got serious about natural climate solutions here in the UK, not just trees, that gets a lot of attention and that's very useful, but actually restoring our peat bogs, our seagrasses, our salt marshes, and actually just the abundance of nature, then that could suck up carbon equivalent to a third of the UK's current emissions. Now, a very important thing to say here, we're not suggesting for a minute that you do that instead of cutting carbon pollution from source. We absolutely have to cut carbon as fast as we can from transport, from industry, from houses, from buildings. We have to do all of that. But if we're going to have any hope of getting to net zero and going beyond that, which is what we've got to do as well, we've got to actually suck carbon out of the air, then nature-based solutions will be absolutely critical in doing that.
And is that potential in specially protected nature reserves, or is it on farmland, or is it on urban fringes? Because I think there's some doubt as to how this potential can really be liberated now. A lot of farmers are very doubtful that they're going to be given any kind of support to do nature-based climate interventions, as it were. Is it only in special nature reserves that this stuff's going to happen, or is it much more widely spread?
No, it's got to be everywhere. I mean, we estimate as the Wildlife Trust that we need to see at least a third of our land and sea put into nature recovery by 2030, and actually probably around 50% by 2050. But we can absolutely do that. Yes, that's about growing out, if you like, from the current nature reserves and protected sites. And some of our designated sites are not being managed particularly well for nature at the moment anyway, but we need to protect and connect those. So we need to be seeing, particularly using river corridors, using field margins, replacing hedgerows, getting hedgerows back again. It could be about greening the green belt around our towns and cities. It could even be about roadside verges and along railway lines and so on. And particularly in our marine environment, the real potential to put nature into recovery in our marine environment could be absolutely huge. So that's the kind of level of ambition we need. We need to see a transformation in the abundance and functioning of nature across the UK in the decade ahead. And if we can do that, that will play such a big role in helping us tackle climate. I'll give you another statistic that will blow your mind, Jonathan, is that around a third of emissions associated with UK agriculture actually come from fenland soils in the east of England, where I am now in and around Cambridge. And that's because those fenland soils have been dried out, and actually the peat is oxidizing into the air, and we're losing about 2 centimeters of that every year. It's the equivalent of 1,800 Olympic-sized swimming pools that are being lost of peat to the air every year. Huge amount of carbon emissions. If we can go to wet farming there on those soils, where actually we could be growing things like sphagnum moss, which has huge uses in the health industry, and we can grow crops there in wet farming. Actually, we can actually start growing peat again and sucking carbon out of the air as we farm as well. So the potential is enormous.
Growing peat is, of course, a long-term venture, that's for sure. But this is all, Craig, so this is all, you and I are both involved in this sort of general theme of build back better, trying to persuade this government now that as it sets out to reflate the economy over the course of the next year, put purchasing power back into the economy, that it has to do it in such a way that simultaneously helps us address the climate emergency, degraded nature and so on. And build back better or build back greener, whatever it might be, is now a big theme. So what you're proposing tomorrow is a sort of direct appeal to Rishi Sunak that he has to put all of that stuff into his recovery plans. So just a little bit of politics here. Are you confident that this government is now in listening mode on anything to do with a synergy between addressing the climate emergency and the nature emergency and coming out of COVID-19? What's your read on how things are going down in Whitehall?
The one thing I've learned over the years, Jonathan, is there's never one view in government. They always like to try and pretend there is. Any government, whoever's in power would like to pretend there's a government view, but there's really not. And we've been having conversations with some ministers at the moment, which are very, very positive. And they're absolutely saying, in fact, I like to say grow back better. Sounds a bit better than build back better. Growing back better is absolutely essential. And they're sort of been on the same page on the rhetoric of that. The problem is, we can go and find other ministers who would completely disagree on that and say that we need to restart the economy exactly as it was before. I think this is such a critical test right now, is that we've been hearing over the last few years, all the rhetoric from government has often been right about how we've got to tackle the climate emergency and we've got to restore nature and so on. It's quite easy to get politicians to say that kind of stuff now. But actually, this is the ultimate test this year as to whether the stimulus package that Rishi Sunak it looks like it's now going to be announced in the autumn, is that really going to restart the economy in the old style as it was before? Or is it going to do what's needed? Is rather than just restart the economy exactly as it was before, is it going to reboot and upgrade the economy to something that's sustainable? And that is absolutely a critical test right now. And the issue is not so much just if they support nice new stuff. So we had the Nature for Climate Fund that was 650 million quid announced earlier in the year. That all sounds very good when you hear that. It's how it compares to the business as usual. So Nature for Climate Fund sounds good, 650 million quid, but compare that to 27 billion pounds that's been earmarked for building new roads. And that really gives you the clue as to what's going on at the moment. Yeah. And so the test later this year is, do they stop the old bad stuff that will just make these problems worse, as well as starting new stuff? And will the new stuff that's sustainable, will it be at the scale of sort of the stimulus packages for the more old-fashioned economy that pollutes and takes us in the wrong direction?
Well, given the expectations of where unemployment is going to be by the autumn, which is clearly going to be a massive hit to the lives of many, many people, particularly young people in the UK, I think they're going to have to think about that job generation story as the top priority. And it is good that people are talking now about the Green New Deal. People are remembering what it was that Roosevelt did in the 1930s in America, not least thinking about the Conservation Corps that he created at that point, which did extraordinary stuff in terms of helping to heal degraded soils, tree planting schemes, just massive, and mobilized tens of thousands of unemployed people, often young people, to get cracking on that kind of stuff. So I'm hopeful that these things have a set of precedents that politicians, if they want to, can really seize hold of. But you can imagine my frustration, Craig, after many, many years banging on about this being a solutions-based agenda. And if politicians had any real imagination or any sense of the potential for this, they would have seized hold of this solutions-based agenda to climate change a long time ago. They wouldn't still be equivocating, sitting on the fence, messing around, which I believe is what they're still doing today. So I guess a lot of that frustration for me comes out in my new book, In Hope in Hell, because I don't actually get the feeling that politicians are fully on board with an understanding of just how advantageous this would be for the other things they care about, for the economy, for more cohesive communities, for a better quality of life, for addressing some of the staggering health inequalities in this country. They don't seem to make the links between these things at all, even now.
No, I'm struck by that time and time and again. It is this issue about how we compartmentalize.
Yeah.
One of the comparisons I've found over the last few months, it has been absolutely appalling, this pandemic and the impact it's had on people's lives, and hearing the daily death toll rising. But I'm struck how, for so many years, our politicians have been deaf and blind, really, to similar death tolls caused by, say, air pollution.
Exactly.
Actually, the government's own figures say that 40,000 people have been dying prematurely in Britain every year because of air pollution. So I would just love to see the same kind of level of energy and determination to deal with those. And they should be much easier problems to solve than this appalling virus and the pandemic that it causes. We've known for years what to do about tackling air pollution and stopping those 40,000 premature deaths in Britain every year. Why don't we see a bit of focus and attention on that? It's really kind of quite strange. So you're absolutely right. I mean, there's so many reasons to be frustrated and pessimistic and annoyed and all of those kind of things with these politicians that just don't seem to really get the opportunity ahead of us. But I think all we can do is just keep arguing, keep pushing, keep the activism really moving, and put this in front of people loud and clear. And the hope I have got in this, and it's really interesting because in the book you often talk about, you know, the feedback loops and tipping points we have in our natural systems around climate change. And my goodness, you're seeing kind of the fires in the Arctic right now, which are terrifying, and you know, perhaps an example of those positive feedback loops which make runaway climate change move even faster. What I always hope for and cling on to is that actually a lot of our politics and social change is non-linear as well. And very often it can feel like nothing's been happening for years, and then you reach a tipping point and suddenly you're into a new reality.
And we did see quite a bit of that in 2019.
Yeah.
With the emergence of Extinction Rebellion. But for me, even more importantly than that, I think the emergence of young people as a very powerful voice in the debate. And it's not that they haven't been interested in and contributing to concerns about the environment for many, many years, but with the school strikes and with a sense of their own agency here, their own ability to influence things, that started to change the game for me. And I'm still very mindful of the massively important role that young people will play in addressing these different issues. It's a bit difficult for them now. Obviously, a lot of the momentum has gone from the school strikes movement, but it's still there. That energy is still there. And the refusal to put up with the kind of procrastination on the part of politicians, that is still as vibrant as ever. And once they're back out again in our streets and in politicians' faces, I think we'll remember what it was that changed the game back in 2019.
Yeah, I completely agree on that, Jonathan. And you know what really excites me so much about the school strike movement is it's not just what it might have done in 2019, it's how it's sort of set up a whole new generation to be very sensitized and awake to this kind of form of protest and activism. You know, in my experience, and certainly in my years at Friends of the Earth, we often find one of the hardest things to do is to get people to say go on a protest for the very first time. Once you've actually been on a demonstration or something like that, you know, people might be quite worried about it in advance, but once you've been on one, you know that it's actually a very happy affair and it's really uplifting and motivating and incredibly exciting. And the fact that you've now had millions of school children around the world take part in these protests, take part in the school strikes in their teenage years, and they actually see them as a positive way of bringing about change. My goodness, I don't think that's suddenly going to go away when they get into their 20s or their 30s. And I think, you know, politicians need to know I'm delighted to say we've got a very active generation coming through there now that will, I think, hold politicians to account on their actions on this.
And this is important for you, isn't it, in the Wildlife Trust? Because I know that you're thinking a lot about the shape of the Wildlife Trust and its presence in people's lives today. I know you've already started to think a bit about how the Trust can be more responsive to a society that is still an environment movement that is still predominantly white, is still very middle class, is still failing to do much about some of those pressing social needs in so many of our communities today. I mean, this is going to weigh heavily on you, I know, as chief exec, because those are big challenges to address.
They absolutely are. And I think, you know, for far too long, the environment sector in this country has been predominantly white and middle class. And I think even sometimes the approaches it's taken to try and deal with that have been actually quite paternalistic on top of that. And you know, I've actually heard people, I mean, years ago sort of say to me things like, oh, how can we get, you know, other people more involved? How can we get non-white communities involved and so on? That's exactly the wrong way to look at it. Actually, it's not about inviting people to come on our agenda. It's how can we reach out and actually be seen to be relevant on those communities' agenda. I mean, one of the things we did just a couple of weeks ago as the Wildlife Trusts, we expressed our solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. And we had to, that was I think a really important thing to be able to do. And, you know, it not surprisingly, perhaps we might have had a few members somewhere that raised a few issues about that. They were kind of surprised, but there was complete support amongst the staff across the movement for us to do that. Because we absolutely have to show it's not just about expecting people to, if you like, come on our agenda, as it might have been phrased once. We have to show that we're showing solidarity with other communities and their priorities there, and that we're all part of one big movement that's trying to fight for social justice and to address the environment justice as well.
Yeah. Well, again, you won't expect me to be anything other than pleased about that, because I think we've shared a lot of frustration over the years that so much of the social justice side of this, of sustainability in the round, has been ignored by conventional environmental positions. And looking now in the USA in particular, which has had a very lively environmental justice movement for a long time, if you look at the disproportionate environmental impacts on communities of color and on a whole stratum of society in the USA, which simply had no choice about these things. It was the dumping ground for most big industrial toxic development of one kind or another. And the consequences of that are still being worked through. So a big pitch for me in the book, and you'll know this, Craig, has been to point out to people that you're never going to get solutions, if you can call them that, to climate change or collapsing nature if you don't put social justice right up there as a critical precondition for bringing society into the kind of place where it can see how important these things are. It's captured to a certain extent in the notion of a just transition to a low carbon, better world. But boy, have we got some work to do in that area still. We really have.
We absolutely have, Jonathan. I think you put it brilliantly in the book, and really connect it up with these issues. That's what I think is really strong, and how you've done Hope in Hell is that, you know, there's a whole raft of issues that you've talked about there, which many people might see as kind of disconnected, but you've stitched the narrative between them so that it's one coherent narrative, and I think that's really welcome and really needed right now. And on this issue that you're discussing there, there's so much of this is about agency. You know, one of the things that I've learned in my career is the bolder that you want to be on trying to drive for environmental solutions, the more agency and the more involvement communities need in shaping those. You know, there are no solutions to environmental problems that are done to people. The ones that endure have to be those that are done by people. And if you believe that, and I very strongly do, which is why really throughout my career I focused on sort of organizations that are strong and can be strong at the grassroots, then you have to make sure that those grassroots really represent the population at large and have to be accessible and inclusive to as many people as possible, and that actually that they are kind of organized in ways that make sense to the people that are involved here, rather than might make sense to me in a centralized office, you know, with a bit of flip chart paper. And one of the things we did at Friends of the Earth was actually loosen up the model that you'll be very familiar with, Jonathan, of local groups, where for a long time we said the way people have to come together is in a group according to where they live, and we're going to have one per town and one per city and so on. In actual fact, that the community, very rarely nowadays do people necessarily define community just by where they live. I mean, that's always going to be important to some degree, but people will define that they're part of communities that are, might be by ethnicity, it could be by hobby or interest, it could be by age and so on. And what you have to be able to do is make it easy for people to come together into communities that make sense to them, and then give them the power and the agency to act. And then it's like lighting the touch paper. It's really exciting.
So this whole story about the linkages between hope and action, just in terms of what you were saying in that response, Craig, I mean, that seems to me to be critical. I don't think that it's possible to sustain hope if one looks out at the world for what it is today without committing, as a consequence of that, to unremitting action, to, in my opinion, the need for much more radical political action. But we can't do it unless people are prepared to become active participants in that change process rather than be bystanders. And I've written quite a lot about the bystander effect and people needing to put that away and become real participants in this change process. I know that's one of the reasons why you stay hopeful and continue to work away at this stuff year after year. Sometimes one wonders how that's possible. But what else is there going on in your life personally that keeps that hope alive?
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny old thing, isn't it, Jonathan, is that a lot of people would kind of caricature environmental campaigners as sort of quite miserable people that are talking about all the things that are wrong in the world. Actually, I find we're one of the most hopeful, optimistic bunch you can get.
Yep.
Because actually, you can't possibly do this job. You can't possibly be an environmental activist unless you're sort of fundamentally optimistic at heart, despite all the science pointing in the wrong direction. Because you have to really focus on the change that might just be possible. And time and again, over many decades now, I've been told something cannot be done. I've had cabinet ministers say that will never happen, and they've sworn at me and said, "Don't be so stupid. We're not going to do that." And you keep plugging away, and finally it happens. We were told, fracking was definitely going to come to the UK, and we worked with local communities and stopped it. We've been told with absolute certainty time and again that a third runway would get built at Heathrow. Put it this way, I wouldn't want to put money on it. And, so I think as long as you keep campaigning, as long as you're focused on the activism, as long as you build support of public behind an issue, then the reality can change. And then we can focus on that optimism. And I think what I like in Hope in Hell is you deal with this straight on about with the science, because the science is the hardest thing to argue with. You can argue with politicians and so on, but the science is really difficult and is pointing in the wrong direction. What keeps me hopeful there is, it sounds rather strange, is that in one sense it's already too late. So in each way, what keeps me hopeful is, well, we're still here at the moment, and we've seen some things move much faster than we ever thought they would. In terms of renewable energy, the uptake has been much quicker than a lot of people predicted. The costs have come down faster than predicted. The school strikes we could never quite predicted to happen in that way. If you look at it, the whole last decade is littered with lots of things that have moved faster than we dared to ever hope. Much as there's been lots of things moving in the wrong direction as well. We don't know what's around the corner. The future is there for our making, and the more we get organised, the more people we involve, the chances are it will be a better future than it would be otherwise.
Yeah, well, you're here to that. And I guess that you and I are both going to be very focused now over the next 6 months, the next year, to see how we can make the best of this post-COVID world. It's going to be so bizarre, but some critical things which we can't get into today, not least reminding everybody that connection with the natural world is actually a critical predeterminant of good health. And the evidence about that is overwhelming. As you know, one of my roles in life is I'm president of the Conservation Volunteers, and I just look at the evidence base which shows the massive uplift in people's well-being and their physical and mental health just by having an opportunity to be in nature, to be doing stuff with other people in nature. So whatever else emerges from this kind of coronavirus crisis, that's the one we have to hang on to, that this connection with the natural world is not just a nice to have for a few lucky people who've got a nice park to walk in or wonderful woodlands nearby. This is something that has to be a presence in everybody's life. And I really look forward to seeing the contribution the Wildlife Trusts are going to make to that. So listen, Craig, that's our half an hour more or less up. Thank you for your insights. I'm looking forward to the sort of campaigning sense that will emerge through what you're doing. And I know that you and I will stay in touch on this for as long as we stay at it, that's for sure. So thank you very much.
I do love the new book. So there it is. I've got my paper copy now. And I would love you to sign it, but it's a bit tricky right now. That might have to wait for one day. But
don't worry, as soon as I can sign it, I will be celebrating the fact that we can be together again, which will be lovely. Thanks, Craig.
Brilliant book. Congratulations, Jonathan.
Thank you very much.